Number 1. Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell. Lori Vallow Daybell was born in Loma Linda, California, and Chad Daybell was in Provo, Utah. Years before the murders, Chad built a small following in fringe prepper circles as an end-times author and publisher, telling people he received visions and spiritual downloads about what was coming. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was their formal religious background, but investigators later said their beliefs had drifted far outside mainstream teachings, especially the way they talked about light and dark, spirits, possession, and a coming apocalypse. Lori's life before Chad was already full of turmoil, multiple marriages, ongoing family conflict, and a tight bond with her brother Alex Cox, who repeatedly acted like her protector. Meanwhile, Chad was married to Tammy Daybell and living in Rexburg, Idaho, selling the idea that doomsday was close. Lori met Chad through the prepper ecosystem around conferences, books, and podcasts, and the relationship turned into an affair. Prosecutors later argued that once Lori and Chad decided they were meant to be together, the people around them, spouses, children, and anyone who questioned them, started getting relabeled as obstacles. The chain of violence began in Chandler, Arizona on July 11, 2019. Lori's estranged husband, Charles Vallow, came to the home and was shot and murdered by Alex Cox. In the moment, Cox claimed self-defense and no immediate charges were filed, but investigators later focused on the delay before the emergency call and the wider context, Lori's escalating end-times claims, her affair with Chad, and the way she and her circle talked about Charles as if he was no longer himself. That murder, prosecutors later said, cleared a path both emotionally and financially for what Lori and Chad wanted next. After Charles died, Lori moved with her children to Rexburg, Idaho, where Chad lived. After moving, her 16-year-old daughter, Tylee Ryan, was last seen on September 8, 2019, and also her 7-year-old son, Joshua Jackson Vallow, was last seen on September 22, 2019. The core detail that alarmed everyone later was that Lori did not report either child missing, and she continued presenting normal explanations to friends, family, and school officials while the children vanished from daily life. When relatives pushed for answers, especially Jackson's grandparents, police welfare checks began and the story started falling apart. While the children were disappearing, the violence around the group widened. On October 2, 2019, Lori's nephew-in-law Brandon Boudreaux survived a shooting attempt in Arizona. Then, on October 19, 2019, Chad's wife Tammy was found dead at the Daybell home in Rexburg. Her death was initially treated as natural, but once investigators realized Lori's children were missing and Chad had remarried at lightning speed, Tammy's body was exhumed and the death was later ruled a homicide. 2 weeks after Tammy's death, Lori and Chad married in Hawaii and soon moved as if they had cut themselves free from responsibility while the children were still unaccounted for. The case broke fully open when Lori and Chad fled to Hawaii after police questioned Lori about Jackson's location in late November 2019. On February 20, 2020, Lori was arrested for desertion and non-support. Then, on June 9, 2020, investigators searched Chad's property and found the remains of Tylee and Jackson buried on land Chad controlled. Chad was arrested the same day, and prosecutors laid out the theory that the murders were not random. They were tied to the couple's extremist belief system and collecting life insurance money and continuing to receive benefits. The courtroom outcomes came in stages. Lori was tried first in Idaho, and on May 12, 2023, she was found guilty for the deaths of Tylee and Jackson and for conspiracy tied to Tammy Daybell. On July 31, 2023, she was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without parole. Chad was tried separately, found guilty on May 30, 2024, and sentenced to death on June 1, 2024. Even after Idaho, the legal story kept expanding. Lori was extradited to Arizona and tried for conspiracy connected to Charles Vallow's death and the attempt on Brandon Boudreaux. On April 22, 2025, she was found guilty of conspiring to murder Charles. On June 12, 2025, she was found guilty of conspiring to murder Brandon. On July 25, 2025, she received 2 additional life sentences in Arizona. Number 2, Diazian Hossencofft and Linda Henning. Girlie Chu was raised in Malaysia in a Malaysian Chinese household. In the early 1990s, she traveled to the United States, where she later met a man who introduced himself as Diazian Hossencofft at SeaWorld. They married in 1993 and settled in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Girlie worked as a bank teller and lived a relatively quiet life, but the marriage quickly began to fracture. By January 1999, Girlie had moved out and filed for divorce after a domestic violence incident in which Diazian threatened to murder her. She told co-workers she was afraid of him and had discovered that much of his identity, including his medical career, were fabricated. Diazian Hossencofft was born Armand Chavez in Houston, Texas. Over time, he reinvented himself completely. He claimed to be a thoracic surgeon and geneticist with degrees from elite universities, but investigators later confirmed he had falsified transcripts and had been expelled from medical school. He adopted the name Diazian Hossencofft and continued defrauding people by selling fake medical treatments and claiming to suffer from leukemia. While still married to Girlie, he maintained multiple relationships at once. One of those women was Linda Henning, who was born in Hollywood, California. Henning was a former fashion model and designer who became deeply involved with Diazian in 1999. The two bonded over conspiracy theories involving government plots, extraterrestrials, and secret powers. On the morning of September 10, 1999, Girlie Chu failed to show up for work. Her co-workers immediately reported her missing, alarmed by the sudden silence. Diazian was quickly identified as a person of interest, but police learned he had already left Albuquerque for South Carolina that same day. Investigators searched Girlie's apartment and noticed a strong smell of bleach. Luminol testing revealed large areas of blood, indicating a violent assault had taken place. Despite extensive searches, Girlie's body was never found. The investigation shifted from missing person to homicide, with attention turning to those closest to Diazian. Linda Henning initially told investigators she did not know Girlie Chu and had no involvement in her disappearance. That statement unraveled quickly. Police established that Henning banked at the same branch where Girlie worked and had interacted with her directly. Henning was charged with perjury in October 1999. Further searches uncovered a ninja sword in Henning's attic that had been purchased on the morning Girlie disappeared. Days later, Girlie's clothing was found discarded on a tarp near Belen, New Mexico. A piece of duct tape recovered from the scene contained hair consistent with Henning's. As evidence mounted, investigators uncovered increasingly disturbing statements from the suspects involving ritual beliefs, alien queens, and claims that Girlie's body would never be recovered. Facing the possibility of a death sentence, Diazian Hossencofft pleaded guilty in January 2002. He admitted responsibility for Girlie Chu's murder and was sentenced to life in prison plus 61 years. In exchange, he avoided trial. Linda Henning went to court later that year, and her trial drew national attention due to its bizarre claims and lack of a body. In a dramatic move, Diazian testified in Henning's defense, insisting that he alone orchestrated the murder and that Henning was innocent. He attempted to shift blame to another associate, but prosecutors argued his testimony was a calculated effort to protect her and confuse the jury. On October 25, 2002, Linda Henning was found guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, conspiracy, tampering with evidence, and multiple counts of perjury. She faced the death penalty but was ultimately sentenced to 73 years in prison. During sentencing, prosecutors cited statements attributed to Henning suggesting cannibalism and asserting that Gurley's remains would never be found. Gurley Chu's body has never been recovered. Number 3. Paul Bernardo and Carla Homolka. Paul Kenneth Bernardo grew up in Scarborough, Ontario, where his early life appeared outwardly ordinary, shaped by middle-class surroundings, school, and social activities. Behind that appearance, however, the household was deeply troubled. His father carried out years of abuse against Paul's older sister, while his mother became emotionally withdrawn, often isolating herself for long periods in the basement. By his teenage years, Paul was already developing violent fantasies and a need for domination. In high school and later at the University of Toronto Scarborough campus, he learned how to mask those urges behind charm. To classmates and girlfriends, he appeared confident and intelligent. In private, he became controlling and humiliating partners during intimate moments, threatening them into silence and showing early signs of the predator he would become. Between 1986 and 1990, Bernardo carried out a series of assaults across Scarborough that terrorized the area. He stalked young women as they walked home from bus stops at night, followed them to their houses, and attacked them in backyards or doorways. Some victims fought him off, while others were assaulted at knife point. Police called him the Scarborough Assaulter, yet despite composite sketches and multiple tips pointing toward Bernardo, he remained free. He was questioned and even gave DNA voluntarily, but delays and misjudgments kept him off the suspect list long enough for the violence to escalate. During this period, he spoke openly to friends about rough intimacy and domination, treating violence as something normal and something he believed he was entitled to. In October 1987, Bernardo met Carla Homolka. She was younger, outwardly cheerful, and came from a stable family in St. Catharines. What made the relationship dangerous was not that she was naive, but that she quickly aligned herself with Bernardo's fantasies. Instead of resisting his sadism, she encouraged it. Over time, she became actively involved. By 1990, Bernardo was spending long hours at Carla's family home, where he became fixated on her 14-year-old sister Tammy. Carla did not protect her sister. Instead, she assisted Bernardo breaking into Tammy's room, helping him watch her, and eventually participating directly in her abuse. The first death came on December 23, 1990. Carla intoxicated Tammy with stolen veterinary anesthetics and sleeping pills, intending to render her unconscious so Bernardo could attack her. Tammy lost consciousness, vomited, and stopped breathing. Instead of calling for help immediately, the couple attempted to clean evidence and stage the scene. Emergency services were contacted only after it was too late. Tammy died that morning. Her death was ruled accidental and no charges were filed. Behind closed doors, Bernardo and Carla videotaped themselves having intimacy afterward, with Carla wearing Tammy's clothing. Rather than stopping the death, removed a boundary. By June 1991, the couple escalated again. They abducted 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey after finding her locked out of her house late at night. They brought her to their home, where they imprisoned, assaulted, and tortured her over hours, filming the attacks. When they decided she could identify them, they murdered her. Her body was dismembered, encased in concrete, and dumped in Lake Gibson. One block surfaced the same day Bernardo and Carla were married. Police recovered it, but at the time no suspect was identified. The couple returned to daily life, hosting family dinners, attending social events, and continuing as if nothing had happened. The final murder occurred in April 1992. 15-year-old Kristen French was abducted in broad daylight outside her school. Witnesses saw parts of the kidnapping, and police immediately treated it as a serious crime. French was held captive, assaulted, and tortured over an Easter weekend while the couple visited family between attacks. Unlike Mahaffey, French was never blindfolded. Prosecutors later argued that she was always meant to be murdered. Her body was discovered weeks later in a ditch. This time, the similarities between cases forced investigators to act. A dedicated task force reopened old evidence, and attention returned to Bernardo. The case finally collapsed from the inside. In December 1992, Bernardo brutally beat Carla, sending her to the hospital. Her family intervened, and Carla separated from him. While presenting herself as a battered spouse, she began revealing pieces of the truth to police, first about abuse, then about the murders. In February 1993, DNA results confirmed that Bernardo was the Scarborough assaulter. He was arrested. Carla, through her lawyer, negotiated a plea deal before investigators discovered videotapes that showed her active participation in the crimes. She pleaded guilty to manslaughter and received 12 years in prison in exchange for testifying against Bernardo. At trial in 1995, the videotapes finally recovered shocked the courtroom. Bernardo attempted to shift blame onto Carla, claiming the deaths were accidents or that she was the true killer. The jury rejected it. He was convicted of first-degree murder for Leslie Mahaffey and Kristen French and declared a dangerous offender, receiving life imprisonment with no parole eligibility for at least 25 years. Carla served her sentence and was released in 2005 under a new identity. Bernardo remains incarcerated, repeatedly denied parole, and classified as a continuing risk. Number 4. Mark Spotz and Christina Noland. Mark Spotz was a 23-year-old with a growing criminal history when his life detonated in late January of 1995. He was dating Christina Noland, who had no reputation like his and was seen by people around her as a good kid before she was pulled into his chaos. The spark came from inside the family during a fight in Clearfield County at their mother's home. Spotz shot and murdered his brother, Dustin Spotz, during an argument that spiraled out of control. That killing is consistently treated as the first death in the spree timeline. After the shooting, Spotz and Noland ran fast, and their next decisions centered on survival, finding a vehicle, getting money, and creating distance from police. Early on February 1st in Pine Grove, Pennsylvania, June Olinger, a 52-year-old mother heading to work, was abducted, robbed, and murdered. Her body was found beneath a bridge, shot in the back of the head, and her car and purse were taken. It was an early sign that the murders were tied to carjacking and escape. Surveillance footage later placed two people together with her vehicle, tightening the focus on a male and female pair on the move. The very next day, the pattern repeated in a different county. Penny Gunnett, a 41-year-old woman driving to work, was also abducted and murdered. In court summaries, prosecutors emphasized the same motive thread involving robbery, the theft of a car, and the need to keep moving before police could catch up. The case was becoming a chain rather than isolated scenes, with one act feeding the next and one stolen vehicle leading to another murder once the previous car became too hot. What made this spree especially grim was how quickly the violence escalated while the geography widened. After the second carjacking murder, Spotz moved again, this time without Noland. In Cumberland County, Betty Amstutz, a 71-year-old woman, was taken and murdered, and her car was stolen as well. Court records describe this as part of the same flight, with a man trying to outrun capture and using murder as a shortcut to transportation and time. Noland eventually broke from him at least enough to open a door for police. In versions repeated across multiple accounts, she contacted authorities and told them what happened, saying she stayed because she feared him and feared what he would do if she turned against him. Investigators used that cooperation along with evidence from the stolen vehicles and the murders to locate Spotz. After a brief standoff at a motel, he surrendered and was arrested, ending a run that court records describe as 4 deaths within a tight window from January 31st through February 2, 1995. The legal ending split the couple in a way familiar to many killer couple cases. One became the state's witness while the other became the face of the spree. Spotz was convicted in multiple counties. He received death sentences for the murders tied to June Olinger and Betty Amstutz, and court listings along with later summaries consistently describe him as having 3 death sentences overall for the 3 women murdered during the Potter. Carjackings. Noland accepted a plea deal, testified against him, received prison time, and was later released. Number 5. Michael Bear Carson and Suzanne Bear Carson. Michael Bear Carson, originally named James Clifford Carson, crossed paths with Suzanne Bear Carson, whose birth name was Susan Barnes, during a turbulent time in his life. They met after James's life started sliding. By 1977, he was in Phoenix when his first wife noticed severe behavior changes, feared for herself and their child, and left. Not long after, he began a relationship with Susan, a divorcee raising 2 teenage sons. Together they leaned hard into illegal substances and mysticism, and James began rebranding himself, calling himself Michael Bear and claiming God gave him the name, while Susan became Suzanne Bear. By 1980, after a year-long trip through Europe, they returned to the United States and settled in the counterculture pocket of Haight-Ashbury. They were living in a place where odd beliefs did not automatically stand out, and that helped them blend. Behind the scenes, Michael's former wife was so afraid he would harm her or abduct their daughter that she moved repeatedly and cut off contact with shared acquaintances. The first murder tied to them happened in March 1981 in San Francisco. Their roommate, Karen Barnes, a 23-year-old aspiring actress from Georgia, was found dead inside their shared apartment. She had been stabbed repeatedly and her head had been crushed. She was then wrapped and hidden in the basement, which pointed to someone she knew rather than a stranger. Before police could close in, the Carsons vanished. Later they confessed they murdered her because Suzanne decided Karen was a witch. That word witch was not a throwaway. It became the justification they kept returning to. After that murder, they ran the way fugitives do when they know the heat is real. They disappeared into a mountain hideout near Grants Pass, staying out of sight until spring of 1982, and then resurfaced in Alder Point, California, where they lived and worked on a marijuana farm. People who encountered them later described them as extreme talking revolution, predicting apocalypse, and treating ordinary disputes like moral warfare. That farm became the scene of their second confirmed murder. In May 1982, Michael shot and murdered a farm worker named Clark Stevens after a dispute. They attempted to destroy the evidence by burning the body and hiding the remains under chicken fertilizer in the woods. Stevens was reported missing, and investigators eventually found the burned remains. When detectives searched what the Carsons left behind, they found writings that added a new layer of alarm. The material included a manifesto calling for the assassination of then-President Ronald Reagan. Authorities were now dealing with a couple tied to murder, running from warrant pressure and speaking as if political violence was part of the mission. They nearly slipped away again. In November 1982, Michael was briefly picked up by police in Los Angeles after someone recognized him. A police error led to his release before homicide detectives could reach him. He vanished, leaving behind clues like a mugshot and identifying information that should have tightened the net but did not stop him. Their final murder and the moment the spree collapsed came in January 1983. The Carsons were hitchhiking near Bakersfield when they were picked up by John Charles Helyar, a 30-year-old headed toward Santa Rosa. According to case accounts, Suzanne again labeled the target a witch, and the situation exploded while Helyar was driving on U.S. Route 101 in Sonoma County. A struggle spilled onto River Road. Suzanne stabbed Helyar while Michael fought for control of a gun. Michael then shot Helyar in view of passing motorists. One driver called police. A pursuit followed. The stolen car crashed and both were arrested. After arrest, they did something most killer couples never do. They held a press conference and confessed to all three murders: Karen Barnes, Clark Stevens, and John Helyar. They later attempted to retract the confessions and pleaded not guilty before trial. The convictions followed anyway. In June 1984, they were convicted first for Barnes's murder and later convicted for Stevens and Helyar, with the later convictions upheld on appeal. The press branded them the San Francisco witch killers because they insisted their violence was a mission to eliminate people they believed were witches. Neither became known for remorse in the years that followed. Michael remains incarcerated in California, and Suzanne remains incarcerated as well, with parole hearings repeatedly drawing opposition from victims' families and prosecutors. Number 6. Douglas Clark and Carol Bundy. Douglas Daniel Clark grew up in what appeared to be a stable and privileged military family. His father served as a high-ranking naval intelligence officer, which meant Clark spent much of his childhood moving between countries while attending elite schools, including the International School of Geneva. On the surface, his upbringing was comfortable, but by his teenage years, his inner life had already taken a dark turn. Clark later admitted that while still in school, he secretly recorded intimate encounters without consent and became fixated on violent fantasies involving assault, mutilation, and necrophilia. These fantasies did not fade with adulthood. Instead, they deepened as his life became more unstable. After graduating high school in 1967, Clark joined the United States Air Force and was stationed in Colorado and Ohio. His military career was short-lived and ended in discharge. After that, he drifted for years, taking low-level mechanical jobs and failing to maintain stability. By the late 1970s, Clark was living in Los Angeles, working briefly for the Department of Water and Power before being fired from another job at a soap factory for violent threats toward coworkers. He spent most nights in bars, targeting lonely women he could manipulate financially or emotionally. It was on Christmas Day, 1979, at a bar called Little Nashville that he met Carol Mary Bundy. Carol Bundy's life had been shaped by trauma long before Clark entered it. Born on August 26, 1942, she endured a childhood marked by alcoholism, neglect, and repeated sexual abuse by her father beginning at age 11. Her mother died early, and she was passed through foster homes before entering a pattern of damaging relationships, including a marriage at 17 to a man nearly 40 years older. By the time she met Clark, Bundy was 36, newly separated from her third abusive marriage, and emotionally vulnerable. Clark moved in with her quickly, and the two discovered they shared intimate interests rooted in domination, pain, and control. Their relationship escalated rapidly into a sadomasochistic partnership. Clark frequently brought intimacy workers to Bundy's apartment for group encounters, and Bundy actively participated. Over time, Clark began openly discussing his desire to murder women during those intimate encounters. Instead of distancing herself, Bundy enabled him. At Clark's request, she purchased firearms, fully aware of what he intended to do. By early 1980, fantasy turned into action. On January 26, 1980, the partial remains of two unidentified women were found in a riverbed near Valencia, California. Both had been shot in the head. These victims became known as the Valencia Jane Does and marked the beginning of the Sunset Strip murders. As the months progressed, the violence intensified. On June 30, 1980, the mummified body of 17-year-old runaway Marnette Comer was discovered near the Golden State Freeway. She had last been seen alive weeks earlier working as a young street worker. Just weeks before that, on June 11, 15-year-old Gina Morano and 16-year-old Cynthia Lee Chandler vanished while trying to meet friends. Their bodies were found the next morning near the Ventura Freeway, each shot in the head. Clark later returned home and calmly described to Bundy how he had forced the girls to perform intimate acts, murdered them, and then assaulted their bodies afterward. Bundy was disturbed but chose silence, making only a vague call to police that concealed Clark's identity. The partnership reached a new level of depravity on June 24, 1980, when Clark murdered 2 street workers in one day. Karen Lee Jones was found behind a Burbank steakhouse, murdered by a single gunshot to the head. Hours later, pedestrians discovered the headless body of Exie LaFay Wilson in Studio City. Clark had decapitated Wilson and taken her head home. Bundy did not resist or flee. Instead, she put makeup on the dead head while Clark engaged in necrophilia. Days later, they placed the head in a decorative box and dumped it in a Hollywood alley. This moment made clear that Bundy was not merely present. She was complicit and actively involved. The murders began to unravel when Bundy's former lover, John Robert Murray, grew suspicious. On August 5, 1980, after attending one of his performances, Bundy drunkenly revealed details of the murders. When Murray implied he might contact police, Bundy acted first. She lured him into his van, shot him, stabbed him, and decapitated him. His body was found days later, but his upper body was never recovered. Under mounting psychological pressure, Bundy confessed to co-workers who alerted authorities. On August 11, 1980, both Bundy and Clark were arrested. Murder weapons were later found hidden at Clark's workplace. Clark was charged with 6 murders and chose to represent himself in court, deliberately dragging out proceedings and blaming Bundy for the crimes. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder. In 1983, he was convicted and sentenced to death in California. Bundy accepted a plea deal in exchange for her testimony, receiving a sentence of 52 years to life. Bundy died in prison from heart failure in December 2003. Clark remained on death row for 4 decades before dying of natural causes on October 11, 2023. Together, Douglas Clark and Carol Bundy became known as the Sunset Strip Killers. Number 7. David Birnie and Catherine Birnie. David John Birnie was born in Perth, Western Australia, and grew up in a deeply unstable household. Friends, neighbors, and church members later described his family life as chaotic and marked by alcoholism, neglect, and persistent rumors of incest. Meals were irregular, supervision was minimal, and boundaries were largely absent. From an early age, David showed disturbing behavior. He left school at 15 to work as an apprentice jockey, where he abused horses and began exposing himself publicly. As a teenager, he committed a violent attempted assault on an elderly woman while boarding at her home after breaking into her room wearing a makeshift mask. By adulthood, he had already accumulated a criminal record and developed compulsive assault behavior fueled by illicit online images and fantasies of domination. Catherine Margaret Harrison, on the other hand, grew up surrounded by tragedy and instability. Her mother died when Catherine was just 2 years old, and her newborn brother died days later. Unable to cope, her father sent her to live with her grandparents before reclaiming custody years later. Catherine met David when she was 12, and by 14 they were in an intimate relationship. Her father repeatedly begged her to leave him, but Catherine's attachment to David only deepened. Her involvement with him led to repeated trouble with police and time in a youth detention center. In an attempt to stabilize her life, Catherine married another man, Donald McLaughlin, had 7 children, and lived a seemingly domestic life. However, the relationship was unhappy, and in 1985 Catherine abandoned her family and returned to David, legally changing her surname to Birnie. From that point, their relationship became exclusive, intense, and increasingly violent. By late 1986, David and Catherine were living together at 3 Moorhouse Street in Willigee, which was a quiet Perth suburb. Outwardly, they appeared unremarkable. David worked at a car wrecking yard while Catherine played the role of a submissive partner. Behind closed doors, however, their relationship revolved around control, intimate violence, and shared fantasies of abduction and murder. Over a period of just 5 weeks, the Birnies abducted 5 women and girls aged between 15 and 31. All but one were assaulted and murdered either inside their home or shortly after being held there. Catherine was not a passive bystander. She assisted in abductions, restrained victims, enforced obedience, and in one case personally carried out a murder to prove her loyalty to David. The first victim was 22-year-old Mary Nielsen, who was a psychology student at the University of Western Australia. David met her through his job and offered to sell her cheap car tires. When Mary visited the Moorhouse Street house on October 6, 1986, she was gagged, chained to a bed and assaulted by David while Catherine watched. She was later driven to a remote bushland area in Bedfordale where she was assaulted again, choked with a nylon cord, and stabbed. David believed stabbing would speed decomposition, which was a method he claimed to have read about. Catherine assisted in burying Mary in a shallow grave. Mary was just 1 year away from graduating when she was murdered. 2 weeks later, the Birnies abducted 15-year-old Susanna Candy while she was hitchhiking. She was bound at knife point and held captive at Moorhouse Street. The couple forced her to write letters to her family to prevent suspicion. After repeated assaults, David attempted to choke her but failed. They then forced sleeping pills down her throat. When she was unconscious, David placed the cord around her neck and demanded that Catherine murder her to prove her devotion. Catherine complied and murdered Susanna while David watched. The girl was buried near Mary's grave. Later, Catherine stated that she felt nothing and described the act as a test of her inner strength and loyalty. On November 1, 1986, 31-year-old Nolene Patterson ran out of fuel on Canning Highway. The Birnies offered help and abducted her. She was taken to Moorhouse Street and repeatedly assaulted by David. Unlike the previous victims, David became emotionally fixated on Noeline and kept her alive for 3 days. Catherine grew intensely jealous and issued an ultimatum. Noeline had to die or Catherine would murder herself. David forced sleeping pills down Noeline's throat and strangled her while she slept. Catherine reportedly took pleasure in throwing sand on Noeline's face as they buried her body separately from the others. The fourth murder occurred on November 5, 1986. 21-year-old Denise Brown was abducted from a bus stop and taken to Moorhouse Street. The following day, she was driven to the Wanneroo Pine Plantation. David assaulted her repeatedly, then attacked her in the neck. Believing she was dead, the Birnies buried her in a shallow grave. Denise regained consciousness and sat up. David retrieved an axe and struck her twice before burying her again. This murder demonstrated how far the couple had descended as they continued the violence even when confronted with the reality that their victim was still alive. Their final victim, 17-year-old Kate Moore, was abducted on November 9th. Unlike the others, she survived. She was threatened with a knife, forced to contact her mother under duress, and held overnight at Moorhouse Street. After David left for work the next day, Catherine forgot to restrain her. Kate escaped through a window, injured herself while fleeing, and eventually reached help. She provided police with detailed information including the Birnie's address, a drawing hidden inside the house, and even the movie they had watched together. Police arrested David and Catherine later that day. Under questioning, their stories conflicted, but David eventually confessed and led police to the burial sites. Both David and Catherine Birnie pleaded guilty to 4 counts of murder and were sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum of 20 years before parole eligibility. David Birnie died by himself in Casuarina prison on October 7, 2005. Catherine Birnie remains imprisoned, having been officially designated as never to be released. The Moorhouse murders shocked Australia not because of their length, but because of their intensity. 5 weeks of calculated abduction, shared cruelty, and deliberate violence carried out by a couple who fed off each other's darkest impulses. Number 8. Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Ian Brady was basically from Glasgow, and his early life was marked by instability, crime, and a growing fascination with violence. As a teenager, he appeared repeatedly before juvenile courts and later served time in prison and Borstal after moving to Manchester. By the late 1950s, Brady worked a clerical job and projected discipline and intelligence. Privately, however, he immersed himself in extremist ideology, writings on cruelty, and fantasies about power. He spent long hours riding his motorcycle into remote countryside, which were places he would later use to conceal crimes. Myra Hindley, on the other hand, was born in Manchester and grew up in a household dominated by poverty, fear, and her father's violence. From a young age, she learned that aggression was rewarded and submission meant survival. As a young woman, she worked clerical jobs and searched for direction and belonging. In January 1961, she met Brady at work. She quickly became emotionally attached, and their relationship evolved into one defined by isolation, manipulation, and Brady's growing psychological control over her. As a couple, Brady and Hindley created a private world shaped by obsession and careful planning. They spent evenings watching films, drinking, and reading about Nazi atrocities and philosophical ideas centered on domination. Brady spoke openly about committing the perfect murder, and Hindley became increasingly involved in facilitating his ideas. She hired vehicles, drove him to remote areas, and helped lure victims using a calm appearance that lowered suspicion. Their first known victim was 16-year-old Pauline Reed, who was abducted on July 12, 1963, after Hindley offered her a lift and drove her to Saddleworth Moor under the pretense of searching for a lost glove. Brady assaulted and murdered her, cut her before burying her in a shallow grave. The pattern continued with 12-year-old John Kilbride in November 1963. And 12-year-old Keith Bennett in June 1964. Both were lured into Hindley's vehicle and murdered on the moor. Bennett's body has never been found. On Boxing Day 1964, 10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey was taken from a fun fair and brought to Brady and Hindley's home. There she was assaulted, photographed, and recorded on tape as she pleaded for her mother before being murdered and buried on the moor. The crimes remained hidden until October 6, 1965, when Brady murdered 17-year-old Edward Evans inside their home. Hindley summoned her brother-in-law David Smith, who witnessed the murder and reported it to police. The investigation exposed photographs, audio recordings, and burial sites on Saddleworth Moor. Brady and Hindley were convicted in 1966 and sentenced to life imprisonment. Years later, both admitted responsibility for the earlier uncharged murders of Pauline Reed and Keith Bennett, which reopened wounds that had never healed for the victims' families. In 1987, guided by Hindley's information, police returned to Saddleworth Moor and recovered Pauline Reed's remains more than 2 decades after her disappearance. Keith Bennett's body, however, was never found despite repeated searches and limited cooperation from Brady. Hindley continued to insist she had been rehabilitated and sought release, while Brady made clear he never wanted freedom. Hindley died in prison in 2002, and Brady died in secure hospital custody in 2017. Number 9. Fred West and Rose West. Fred West grew up in Muchmarkel, Herefordshire, where troubling warning signs appeared early in his childhood. These were patterns that later became impossible to ignore. He grew up in poverty, left school at 15, and struggled with learning. What stood out most, however, was his behavior toward women and girls. By his teenage years, Fred was already intimately aggressive and later openly admitted that he had assaulted young girls. In 1961, he was arrested after his 13-year-old sister reported that Fred had been assaulting her and she was pregnant. Fred confessed during police questioning, but the case collapsed when family members refused to testify in court. He avoided prison and walked free, which reinforced a belief that he could commit extreme acts without consequences. After escaping conviction, Fred married Catherine Rena Costello in 1962. Their relationship was violent and unstable, marked by physical abuse and control. They moved between Scotland and England, and Fred's behavior worsened. In July 1967, while living in Gloucestershire, an 18-year-old woman named Anne McFall disappeared. She was 8 months pregnant with Fred's child. She was never reported missing at the time, and Fred continued living freely. Decades later, her dismembered remains were found buried in a field. Evidence showed she had been restrained before being murdered. This crime happened before Rose West entered Fred's life, which proved that Fred was already capable of planning murder and disposing of victims on his own. Fred met Rosemary Letts in early 1969. She was 15 years old, emotionally vulnerable, and came from a background of abuse and neglect. Fred was 27. Despite social services intervening and Rose being placed in care, she repeatedly returned to Fred. By 1971, Fred was sentenced to prison for theft and unpaid fines and was incarcerated at Leyhill Prison. During this time, Rose was left in charge of the household. Fred's stepdaughter, 8-year-old Charmaine, lived with Rose. Witness testimony and forensic evidence later showed that Rose murdered Charmaine while Fred was still in prison, likely during a violent assault. When Fred was released later that year, Charmaine was already dead. Her body was hidden inside the home and later buried in the garden. Fred and Rose then worked together to lie about her disappearance, telling schools, neighbors, and family members that Charmaine had gone to live with her mother. When Fred returned from prison, instead of distancing himself from Rose, their bond strengthened. They married in January 1972 and moved into 25 Cromwell Street in Gloucester. This marked the beginning of their most violent period. Young women were brought into their lives as lodgers, babysitters, or through chance encounters. Some were runaways, others were hitchhikers, and some trusted the couple enough to accept help. Once inside the house, victims were restrained, gagged, assaulted, and tortured. Many were suspended in the cellar using ropes and beams. Death usually came through strangulation or suffocation. Afterward, the bodies were dismembered to make burial easier and to destroy identification. Between 1973 and 1975, the murders accelerated. Victims such as Linda Goff, Carol Ann Cooper, Lucy Partington, Therese Ziegenthaler, Shirley Hubbard, and Juanita Mott were murdered in similar ways. The pattern was consistent. Control came first, silence came second, violence followed, and concealment came last. Missing bones, including fingers and teeth, suggested deliberate removal. They were repeated acts carried out with planning, familiarity, and shared responsibility. Fred handled much of the physical restraint in murders, while Rose actively participated, encouraged the abuse, and helped manage the aftermath. After 1975, the murders slowed, but the violence did not stop. The Wests continued abusing their own children inside the home. Assaults against their daughters became routine. Heather West, born in 1970, grew increasingly distressed as she entered her teenage years. She talked about leaving, confided in friends, and showed signs of long-term abuse. Fred and Rose viewed this as a threat. On June 19, 1987, Heather was murdered inside the home. Fred later claimed it was accidental, but forensic evidence showed restraint, strangulation, and dismemberment. Her body was buried in the garden. Once again, the couple created false stories, claiming she had run away or moved abroad. The case finally collapsed in 1992 after Fred assaulted his youngest daughter, Louise. This time the abuse was reported. While police initially focused on the assault offenses, investigators quickly noticed the long list of unexplained disappearances connected to the family. Heather's case drew particular attention because there were no records showing she was alive. There was no employment history, no benefits, no confirmed sightings, and no contact with anyone outside the family. Each explanation Fred and Rose had given over the years contradicted the last. One moment Heather had supposedly run away. Another time she was said to be living abroad, and later they claimed she was involved in criminal activity and could not come forward. These shifting stories raised immediate suspicion, and police began to treat Heather not as a runaway but as a likely homicide victim. In February 1994, detectives obtained a search warrant for 25 Cromwell Street. What began as a targeted search for Heather quickly escalated when officers uncovered human remains buried in the garden. As excavation continued, more bones were discovered beneath the property, confirming fears that the house concealed far more than a single crime. Fred was arrested and questioned extensively. At first he attempted to control the narrative, admitting to some murders while claiming Rose knew nothing. As pressure mounted and evidence stacked up, Fred began confessing to multiple murders, guiding police to burial sites inside the cellar and around the garden. Each discovery revealed the same disturbing pattern of restraint, violence, dismemberment, and concealment. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the collapse of his attempt to shield Rose, Fred's statements became inconsistent. At times he took full responsibility. At other moments, he shifted blame back onto his wife. Despite his claims, investigators concluded that many of the crimes could not have happened without Rose's involvement. She had been present, aware, and in several cases actively participating. Rose was arrested in April 1994 and charged with murder. The partnership that had allowed them to operate for decades was finally broken apart under scrutiny. While awaiting trial at HM Prison Birmingham, Fred West himself and died on January 1, 1995, avoiding a full public reckoning for his crimes. Rose West, however, went on trial later that year. The court heard detailed testimony from survivors, family members, forensic experts, and investigators. The prosecution outlined Rose's role not only as an accomplice but as an active participant who encouraged abuse, enforced silence, and helped maintain control inside the household. In November 1995, Rose was convicted of 10 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment with a whole life order, ensuring she would never be released. Number 10. Alton Coleman and Deborah Brown. Alton Coleman was from Waukegan and had already drawn law enforcement attention years before the crime spree began. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, he faced repeated allegations of assault and violence along with other serious charges, including a conviction connected to armed robbery and a kidnapping and assault case. By 1984, he was facing trial in Illinois connected to the assault of a young girl, and instead of showing up to face the charges, he ran. Deborah Brown, born in November 11, 1962, had no known violent record before meeting him in 1983. She quickly became part of his world, and by the summer of 1984 the two were moving together from place to place, leaving victims across the Midwest. What followed between late May and July was not a single crime that escalated. It was a rolling spree where the pattern stayed the same. Coleman targeted vulnerable people, violence followed, and the pair kept moving before communities could connect the dots. The crimes stretched across 6 states: Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Ohio, and Kentucky, and investigators ultimately tied them to 8 murders. As the attacks spread, the case became so urgent that the Federal Bureau of Investigation took the unusual step of adding Coleman to an extra slot on the 10 most wanted list for exceptionally dangerous fugitives. Even at the time, authorities described the threat as fast-moving and unpredictable because the couple was not staying in one area long enough to be boxed in. The first known murder that summer began with a young individual. On May 29, 1984, Coleman abducted young Vernita Wheat after befriending her mother and brought the girl back to Waukegan. Her body was found weeks later on June 19 in an abandoned building not far from where Coleman's grandmother lived. Around that same period, Coleman gained access to a man in Waukegan named Robert Carpenter, stayed at his home, then took his car and disappeared. These early moves show how Coleman operated. He slipped into everyday conversations, acted familiar, took what he needed and moved on fast, while Deborah Brown stayed close beside him as the spree gathered momentum. From there, the violence shifted into Indiana and Michigan. In June 1984, the pair assaulted 2 young girls in Gary, 9-year-old Annie Turks and her 7-year-old niece Tamika Turks. Annie survived. Tamika did not, and her body was found on June 19th. That same day, Donna Williams disappeared. Her body was later found in Detroit on July 11th. In between, on June 28th, Coleman and Brown forced their way into a home in Dearborn Heights, beating a couple, ripping out their phone line, and stealing their vehicle. It was another example of how they mixed burglary and car theft into the spree to keep themselves mobile. By early July, they reached Toledo, and Coleman used the same approach. He acted friendly long enough to get close. On July 5th, investigators say he connected with Virginia Temple, a mother of several children. After she stopped contacting relatives, police entered the home and found the younger children alone and terrified. Virginia and her 9-year-old daughter, Rochelle Temple, had been murdered and hidden in a crawl space. That same morning, the pair attacked an elderly couple, bound them with cords, robbed them and stole their car, then continued south. They ended up in the home of a Dayton minister and his wife, where they were allowed to stay for days. The couple could move through normal households without immediately triggering alarm. The case then rolled into Cincinnati. After the minister and his wife dropped them downtown, 15-year-old Tani Story disappeared on July 12th. Her body was found 8 days later. Investigators later linked evidence from the Toledo scene to her murder. By this point, the fear was no longer local, it was regional, and the federal response reflected that. Coleman had already been flagged as so dangerous that he was added to the 10 most wanted list as a special addition, a rare step meant to warn the public and widen the manhunt. On July 13th, the violence hit a suburban home in Norwood. A couple, Harry Walters and his wife Marlene Walters, met Coleman and Brown while discussing a possible camper purchase. Within hours, Harry was left badly injured and Marlene was murdered. The couple's car and belongings were stolen. That stolen vehicle became the next tool in the spree. 2 days later, it turned up abandoned in Kentucky, and authorities determined the pair had kidnapped a college professor, Oline Carmichael Jr., locking him in the trunk as they drove back into Ohio. When the car was abandoned in Dayton on July 17th, Carmichael was discovered alive in the trunk. That outcome helped investigators piece together the couple's route and urgency. After that, the chase tightened fast. Coleman and Brown returned to the minister's home armed, stole another vehicle and headed back toward Illinois. Along the way, the pair stole a car in Indianapolis and murdered its owner, 75-year-old Eugene Scott. Then on July 20, 1984, the spree ended in Evanston, not because the couple made a mistake at a crime scene, but because a resident recognized them and alerted police. Officers located the pair in a park and arrested them without a fight, finding weapons and learning they had been changing clothes frequently as they walked, trying to avoid recognition. In court, the legal outcomes split in a way that reflected their different roles and the death penalty rules of the states involved. Coleman was convicted in Ohio for murders tied to the Cincinnati and Norwood crimes and received death sentences. He also received death sentences in Illinois and Indiana, making him at the time the only person in the United States with death sentences in 3 states. Ohio ultimately carried out the execution on April 26, 2002 at the Southern Ohio Correctional Facility. Brown was initially sentenced to death as well, but Ohio's governor later commuted her sentence to life imprisonment, citing her low IQ scores and the controlling master-slave dynamic described in the case. She remains imprisoned, serving a life sentence without parole in Ohio, with additional sentences from other states layered on top. Number 11. Charles Starkweather and Carol Ann Fugate. Charles Raymond Starkweather was born in Lincoln, and by his mid-teens he had built a reputation for anger and intimidation. He grew up in a working-class home, struggled socially, and later claimed he was bullied for his legs and speech. As he got older, the anger flipped outward. Friends said he could be charming one moment and vicious the next. By the time he was dating Carol Ann Fugate, he was already talking like the world owed him something, and that bitterness started showing in the way he treated strangers. He met Caril when she was 13 and he was 18, and the relationship quickly became intense and controlling. He hung around her school, taught her to drive, and after a crash with his father's car, he was reportedly pushed out of his own home. That period matters because it shows the pressure building. He felt humiliated, stuck, and angry at better-off people. In his own mind, he developed a simple belief. If people were above him, he wanted to drag them down. The first confirmed murder happened before the main spree. Late on November 30, 1957, Starkweather argued with a gas station attendant named Robert Colvert after being refused a stuffed animal on credit. He came back armed, robbed the station, forced the attendant into a car, drove to a remote area, and shot him to death. That murder showed his method early: a small grievance, followed by a sudden jump to lethal control, then flight. The explosion came in January 1958. On January 21st, Starkweather went to the Fugate home. Carol's mother and stepfather told him to stay away. Instead of staying away, he murdered them, then murdered Carol's young half-sister. He hid the bodies on the property and left a note in the window claiming everyone had the flu, buying time while he and Caril stayed inside the house for days. Starkweather later said Carol was present and involved, while Carol insisted he met her with a gun and claimed her family was being held hostage, threatening to murder them if she did not cooperate. Once they fled, the murders turned into a rolling chain. They drove to Bennett, Nebraska, and murdered 70-year-old August Meyer. Soon after, 2 teenagers, Robert Jensen and Carol King, stopped to help them. Starkweather forced them to an abandoned storm cellar, shot Jensen dead, and then murdered King after she resisted his assault. He later tried to shift blame for parts of that scene onto Carol, while she maintained she stayed in the car and did not take part. The question of what Carol truly did versus what Starkweather said she did became the heart of the courtroom fight later. The next step showed how bold he had become. Starkweather and Carol went into a wealthy Lincoln home belonging to Chester Ward and his wife Clara. There, their maid, Lillian Fenkel, was murdered first. Then the couple waited for the homeowners to return and murdered them too, stealing valuables and fleeing in the family's car. Those murders triggered panic, police searches widened, fear spread, and the case turned national because it looked like a young couple was moving freely while bodies piled up behind them. The chase ended in Wyoming. Near Douglas, a traveling salesman named Merle Collison was murdered, and minutes later, Starkweather's escape collapsed for a simple reason. He did not understand the parking brake on the stolen car and stalled. A passing motorist stopped to help. A deputy arrived, and Carol ran toward law enforcement, shouting that it was Starkweather and that he would murder her. Starkweather tried to flee. A high-speed chase followed, and he surrendered on January 29, 1958, after being cut by flying glass when officers fired into the vehicle. After arrest, both were convicted, but the system treated them differently. Starkweather was tried in Nebraska and sentenced to death, then executed by electric chair at the Nebraska State Penitentiary on June 25, 1959, an execution often noted as the state's last until 1994. Carol was convicted as an accomplice in the Jensen murder and given life. The sentence was later commuted, making parole possible, and she was released in 1976 after serving about 17 years. Number 12. Ray Copeland and Fay Copeland. Ray Copeland grew up in Oklahoma, where his early years were marked by instability during the Great Depression. As he got older, he developed a reputation for livestock theft and check fraud, serving short jail sentences before repeatedly returning to the same schemes. After his release in 1940, he met Fay Della Wilson, born on August 4, 1921, and they married that same year. They raised a large family and moved often, partly because money was tight and partly because Ray's name carried trouble wherever he went. By the time they settled on a farm near Mooresville, Missouri, Ray had decades of practice living one step ahead of consequences. The plan that set the stage for the murders was not complicated, but it was effective. Ray could not buy and sell cattle in his own name because people in the area knew his record, so he created a workaround. He would pick up drifters and unemployed men, bring them to the farm as hands, then take them to auctions and cattle sales to make purchases using bad checks. These were checks Ray could not safely put his own name on. The cattle would be resold quickly, and when the checks bounced, the person left holding the blame was the hired man, not Ray. For a while, the pattern worked because the men were transient and hard to trace, and the business trail was muddy by design. But the farmhands did not just disappear on paper. Investigators later tied the couple to the murders of 5 men between 1986 and 1989. Dennis Murphy and Wayne Warner were murdered in 1986, followed by Jimmy Dale Harvey, John Freeman, and Paul Cowart in 1988 and 1989. They were drifters and job seekers, exactly the kind of men Ray targeted because they were less likely to have someone pushing hard when they went missing. The state's theory was blunt. When a man became a liability, someone who could expose the check scheme, connect Ray to fraud, or threaten to go to authorities, Ray eliminated the risk. The break in the case came from someone who survived the farm long enough to speak up. In August 1989, a former employee named Jack McCormick contacted a Crime Stoppers tip line and said he had seen bones on the Copeland property and believed Ray had tried to murder him. Police were skeptical at first. Claims like that can be exaggerated. That changed when they checked Ray's record and saw a long history of fraud and jail time. In October 1989, investigators returned with a search warrant, bloodhounds, and enough manpower to comb the farm properly. At first, the search looked like it might come up empty. Then they found bodies, eventually linking the murders to a .22 caliber Marlin rifle found at the home. Once the bodies were discovered, the question became what role Fay played. The prosecution argued she was not simply around for Ray's crimes. They said she was part of the machinery that kept the farm running, helped control the men, and covered what was happening. Fay's defense presented a different picture, portraying her as a dutiful wife who lived under intimidation and abuse, someone who followed Ray's lead and feared him. The jury did not accept that explanation as a full shield from responsibility. In November 1990, Fay was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder. The sentencing that followed made national headlines because of her age. She received 4 death sentences and 1 life sentence, becoming the oldest woman in the country at the time to face execution. Ray went to trial next. In March 1991, he was convicted of 5 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Unlike many cases where one partner breaks and blames the other, the Copeland prosecutions focused on the same central motive: money and self-preservation. The victims were not chosen for fame or personal grudges. They were chosen because they were vulnerable, easy to recruit, and easy to erase from the paper trail of a cattle fraud. Ray never lived to see the end of the appeals process. He died of natural causes on October 19, 1993, while incarcerated at Potosi Correctional Center. Fay remained on death row for years as her case moved through appeals that challenged parts of the sentencing process. In August 1999, a federal judge overturned her death sentence while leaving the murder convictions intact, commuting her punishment to 5 consecutive life terms without parole. Fay's final years took an unexpected turn. In August 2002, she suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed and unable to speak. Weeks later, the governor authorized medical parole, and she was transferred to a nursing home in Chillicothe, Missouri. She died there on December 23, 2003. Number 13. Michel Fourniret and Monique Olivier. Michel Fourniret was born and grew up in Sedan, France, and long before the crimes that made him widely known, he already had a criminal record involving the targeting of young girls. He was first arrested in the mid-1960s for assaulting a young individual and later imprisoned again in the 1980s for assaults against multiple girls. By the time he met Monique Olivier, he was not a man slipping into crime. He was a repeat offender with a clear pattern. Fourniret placed pen pal ads in a Catholic magazine. Olivier responded, and their letters quickly turned into something chilling. He wrote about fantasies involving assaulting and murdering females, and she did not run, she stayed. The relationship began after his release in 1987. What made the Fourniret-Olivier pairing so dangerous was the way they split the work. Fourniret was the predator, but Olivier often became the safe face, the woman who could approach a teenage girls without triggering alarm. She spoke softly, asked for help, and brought victims close enough for Fourniret to take over. Investigators later described this as a deliberate system: lure, control, transport, then conceal. This structure is also why the crimes lasted across years and across borders, France and Belgium. Their first known murder together, as Fourniret later confessed, happened on December 11, 1987 in Auxerre. 17-year-old Isabelle Laville was spotted walking home from school. Olivier pulled up and asked for directions, drawing the teenager into the car. A short distance away, Fourniret staged a breakdown, climbed inside, and the trap closed. The girl was overpowered, taken to their home, and later the body was thrown into a disused well. It was hidden in a way that delayed answers for years. Her remains would not be recovered until more than a decade later. As the months continued, the crimes did not slow, they expanded. In April 1988, 30-year-old Farida Hamicha was lured out, murdered, and robbed. The couple used what they stole to fund a new life. Later that summer, they returned to targeting young women, approaching them in parking lots, pretending to need help, then shifting to violence once the victim was inside the vehicle. By the end of the decade, their method had hardened into routine. In March 1989, a 19-year-old woman named Jean-Marie Desrameaux was invited to their home under false identities. She was questioned to see if she fit Fourniret's obsession with his particular kind of victims. When she did not, it triggered rage instead of release. She was murdered and buried on property the couple controlled. By December 1989, they crossed into Belgium and targeted another young female, Elizabeth Brichet. They used the same hook, directions to a doctor for a child, before driving her back across the border. She was later buried near other victims. For years, her disappearance spiraled into false sightings and misdirected suspicion, even intersecting with public fear around offenders like Marc Dutroux before the truth finally surfaced. One reason this case cut so deep in France and Belgium was the collateral damage. A single abduction could ruin families for decades, and innocent people were sometimes dragged into the spotlight. In November 1990, 13-year-old Natasha Dane was abducted after being sent on a simple errand, then murdered near the coast. A neighbor was wrongly suspected and later died by self after being accused. Another life lost to the fallout. The cruelty here is not only what Fourniret and Olivier did, but how their lies and the absence of answers created chaos that consumed others as well. After the early 1990s, the couple moved to Belgium. Fourniret later admitted that he resumed killing in the early 2000s, sometimes acting without Olivier physically present, but still following the same predatory logic. Identify a vulnerable young female, isolate her quickly, remove evidence, then disappear across jurisdictions. Everything came to a halt in June 2003. Fourniret was caught after attempting to kidnap a 13-year-old girl in Ciney, Belgium, and the arrest finally stopped him. What broke the silence was not conscience, it was Olivier turning on him. After prolonged interrogation and pressure, she told police that her husband had been killing since 1987, and Fourniret began to confess. The courtroom outcomes came in waves. In May 2008, Fourniret was convicted of 7 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Olivier received life imprisonment with a minimum term for her role in the crimes. Years later, the story continued to expand. Fourniret confessed to additional murders in 2018, and in 2020, he admitted to the murder of Estelle Mouzine, a case that had haunted France since 2003. Fourniret died in custody in May 2021 before facing trial for every confession. The legal pressure did not stop there. In December 2023, a French court convicted Monique Olivier of complicity in multiple murders, including the murder of British student Joanna Parish, sentencing her to life imprisonment. Number 14. Gwendolyn Gale Graham and Catherine May Wood. Gwendolyn Gale Graham was raised in Texas, where she later pursued training as a nurse's aide, stepping into a profession that required direct care for patients who depended fully on those assigned to look after them. In the mid-1980s, Graham relocated to Michigan and took a position at Alpine Manor Nursing Home in Walker, a suburb of Grand Rapids. The facility housed elderly residents, many of whom suffered from Alzheimer's disease or severe physical limitations. Catherine May Wood was born on March 7, 1962. She was already working at Alpine Manor when Graham arrived. Like Graham, Wood was a nurse's aide assigned primarily to overnight shifts. The night shift meant fewer staff on duty, less direct supervision, and long stretches when aides worked alone inside residents' rooms. It was in this environment that Graham and Wood became close. By 1986, the two were not just co-workers but involved in a romantic relationship. Their shared work schedule placed them repeatedly in the same sections of the nursing home during overnight hours. As aides, they were responsible for repositioning residents, checking on breathing, cleaning patients, and responding to call lights. Many residents were sedated or cognitively impaired and could not clearly communicate distress. Deaths during the night were not unusual in long-term care facilities, and when an elderly patient passed quietly in bed, it rarely triggered an autopsy. This context later became central to the prosecution's case. According to testimony later given by Wood, the first murder occurred in January 1987. She claimed Graham entered the room of an elderly woman with Alzheimer's disease and smothered her with a washcloth while Wood acted as lookout. The woman was physically unable to resist. Her death was recorded as natural, and no medical examiner was involved. Nothing about that night raised immediate concern among staff or administrators. Over the following months, 4 more residents died under similar circumstances. The women ranged in age from 60 to 98, and most were severely incapacitated. All were residents Graham and Wood had access to during night shifts. Wood later told investigators that the murders were not random, but part of a shared secret meant to bind the two women together. She claimed they initially tried selecting victims based on initials, and later counted each murder as a day tied to a private phrase they used to describe their relationship. A poem written by Wood and introduced at trial ended with the words, "You'll be mine forever and 5 days." No physical evidence was discovered at the time. There were no visible injuries, no signs of struggle, and no witnesses. Alpine Manor continued operating as usual. The deaths only came under scrutiny after the relationship between Graham and Wood collapsed. Graham began seeing another woman who also worked at the facility and eventually left Michigan, moving back to Texas and finding work in a hospital caring for infants. The investigation began in 1988, not from within the nursing home, but after Wood's ex-husband contacted police. He reported that Wood had spoken to him about murders at Alpine Manor. Detectives interviewed Wood repeatedly. Over time, she described the murders in increasing detail, consistently portraying Graham as the one who physically carried them out. Based almost entirely on these statements, authorities ordered exhumations of 2 former residents who had not been cremated. Medical examinations did not reveal definitive physical proof of smothering, which is not unusual in such cases. Despite this, the county medical examiner ruled the deaths homicides, relying heavily on Wood's statements. Arrest warrants were issued. In early December 1988, Wood was arrested in Michigan, and Graham was arrested in Tyler, Texas. At trial, Wood entered a plea agreement that reduced her charges in exchange for testimony against Graham. She claimed Graham planned the murders and that she herself only assisted or stood watch. Graham denied the accusations, stating that Wood fabricated the story out of jealousy and revenge after being abandoned. The case lacked forensic evidence, but prosecutors presented testimony from Graham's later partner, who said Graham had confessed to murdering nursing home patients. On November 3, 1989, Graham was convicted of 5 counts of murder and conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 5 life terms. She remains incarcerated at the Women's Huron Valley Correctional Facility in Michigan. Wood was convicted of second-degree murder and conspiracy, sentenced to prison, and became eligible for parole years later. She was released in 2020. Number 15. Tony Fratoto and Cody Cree Patton. Tony Fratoto and Cody Cree Patton were both teenagers growing up in West Wendover, Nevada, a small desert town where everyone knew everyone else, and high school relationships often felt intense and inescapable. Patton was born in 1991 and Fratoto in 1992. They attended the same high school as Micaela "Mickey" Costanzo, a 16-year-old athlete known for her academic drive, leadership roles, and talent in basketball and track. Mickey and Patton had previously dated, but by early 2011, Patton was in a relationship with Fratoto, a relationship that witnesses later described as volatile, possessive, and emotionally controlling. In the weeks leading up to the murder, the tension around Patton escalated. Mickey had resumed contact with him, sending messages and trying to reconnect. Prosecutors later argued that this contact became a fixation for Patton and a source of jealousy and paranoia. Around the same time, surveillance footage at West Wendover High School captured a disturbing incident where Patton physically assaulted Fratoto, choking her against a wall and lifting her feet off the ground. Friends noticed Fratoto withdrawing, becoming quieter, and increasingly isolated. Psychological evaluations later suggested she functioned emotionally closer to a mid-teen adolescent rather than an adult, while Patton's behavior showed growing aggression and control. On March 3, 2011, Mickey attended track practice as usual. She never came home. That afternoon, she was lured away from school and into Patton's vehicle under the pretense of talking privately. Fratoto was also present. The drive left town and headed into a remote desert area near the Utah-Nevada border, a location chosen for its isolation. There, Mickey was struck in the head with a shovel. Fratoto later admitted she sat on Mickey's legs to restrain her while Patton slashed her. The injuries showed Mickey did not give up instantly. Her body was buried in a shallow grave in the desert, hidden just enough to delay discovery. After the murder, the pair did not flee immediately. Instead, they returned to town and attempted to resume normal routines, a detail that deeply disturbed investigators once uncovered. Patton was arrested within days after inconsistencies in his statements, and evidence placed him at the center of the disappearance. For more than a month, Fratoto was not considered a suspect. That changed when she approached Patton's defense attorneys and confessed to her role in the murder. The confession stunned both the defense and the prosecution because without it there was little forensic evidence tying her to the scene. The legal paths split sharply. In January 2012, Fratoto pleaded guilty to second-degree murder with a deadly weapon, avoiding the death penalty in exchange for her testimony. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 years, with additional years attached for the weapon enhancement. Patton pleaded guilty in May 2012 to first-degree murder with a deadly weapon. He received life without the possibility of parole, a sentence the judge described as necessary given the brutality and planning involved. In court, the question that lingered was not only how the murder happened, but why. The judge openly stated that despite hours of testimony, no motive fully explained the violence. The prosecution argued it was a convergence of jealousy, control, and obsession, intensified by a toxic relationship dynamic. Years later, Fratoto sought parole in 2021 and again in 2024. Both requests were denied. Prosecutors emphasized that even if parole were ever granted on the murder charge, the deadly weapon enhancement would still keep her incarcerated for years. As of 2026, she remains in prison with a minimum possible release date no earlier than 2030. Patton will never be released. Thank you for watching. Check out these other interesting clips from the channel, and be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to be notified about our latest videos.